You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone, to what I am sure is going to be one of the more unique episodes that we have had in a little while. And that is because I am joined by a guest that I have known for quite a long time. We have with us today a local New Jerseyan. He is a professor at a local college nearby, specializing in some really deep philosophy and also theology that he writes about on his Substack, which I know we will get to talking about soon. So we have with us Eric Evans. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Connor. Appreciate it. Honor to be here with you and to discuss philosophy and theology.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So for any of the listeners, Eric and I have known each other for a very long time because we met playing hockey as kids.
That's right.
Yeah, we had it where we were just doing in-house stuff, so it'd be for like 3 or 4 months at a time, and then they would change up everything. All the teams changed, every several months, but we would play together, and I was usually in goal, and were you wing or defense back then?
I think I was wing. I would kind of go back and forth. Your dad would put me on the wing sometimes, center.
Yeah, my dad usually coached.
Yeah, maybe defense once in a while, but usually offense. Yeah.
And one of the things that really stood out with Eric is even back then, he was always a good hockey player, but I thought always just a good guy too. Hockey is an aggressive sport, and there were a lot of a-hole kids sometimes that would play with us. So it stood out that he was always a nice guy, and just I don't think we would have ever thought back then we'd end up in somewhat similar fields. You're going with some theology and philosophy, and I'm doing a biblical scholarship. So what brought you into those where you thought that you would want to study that professionally? Like, catch me up on the last 10 years here.
Yeah, I mean, I really originally I was going to go into international affairs. That's what I was thinking of. That's what I studied at graduate school, global security studies. And, the political climate dissuaded me a little bit from moving to DC and getting further into that. So I decided to start teaching, and I've been doing that for the past 2 years. And I teach across the humanities and social sciences. And, philosophy, theology, I try to throw that into everything I do. A lot of these areas intersect in really meaningful ways. And I got my bachelor's degrees in philosophy and psychology from Rutgers. And like I said, then I went on to grad school at Hopkins, and a little bit different, but still they overlap, they intersect in meaningful ways. International affairs, global security, philosophy, maybe not theology as much, but definitely philosophy. You can't really escape that. It's really the ground or the bedrock of all knowledge.
Yes, and I followed your Substack for a little while. I appreciate how you explain those topics and try to drill down to that, because I came from having a fundamentalist Baptist Christian background, and philosophy was not something we stressed a lot of. There was a lot of just being certain about our dogma, and I've just realized the more I've studied, the less I was trained in. So I've been trying to branch myself into some philosophy fields, just 101 stuff to try to understand it better.
Absolutely. And philosophy is always going to open a lot of doors, no matter what. So I always really stress that.
With everything. Yeah,
it does. I always stress that to my students and friends. Just study philosophy. It's going to make your theology stronger. It's going to make your science stronger. It's going to make your political understanding, your political orientations much stronger if you have this kind of philosophical side to you, this philosophical understanding.
Absolutely. And did the theology side come in just from being raised Catholic, or was that some other interest that you've had?
So I was raised Catholic in a very loose sense, I would say. Sure. My family was never really too into theology or going to church. We kind of did it because my grandmother was Catholic, and we kind of went along with.
It's a Northeastern Catholic. Yeah, that's just what we are.
Right, what we all do. but not in any kind of robust sense. I wouldn't say I was never really a practicing Catholic, but I've always had a deep affection for understanding how the world works. I was never an atheist or anything like that. I've always believed that there was some kind of purposive agency underlying all of reality. Of course, I didn't word it in that way when I was 15, but I was always struck by the sense of wonder. And I always thought there has to be something underlying all of reality. Why are we here? What's the purpose of all this? So it was really driven by that kind of curiosity and that sense of wonder, rather than any kind of adherence to a particular tradition growing up.
I find that so interesting because I'm learning that the kind of fundamentalism I was raised with strips away that wonder. It forces you to think you have this certainty of belief, and you're not allowed to question, you're not allowed to be curious. And so even though I still consider myself Christian, I sometimes struggle to have a sense of wonderment. And this is even something that I think it wasn't that long ago you wrote a blog post about, just like re-enchanting the world and doing it with wonder.
Sure. Yeah.
So I find that in a modern world where so much is explainable by science, and I always have this little skeptic voice in my head. Whenever something happens that's hard to explain, it's like, but it could be this. And I have a hard time just accepting the enchantment and the wonder. Have you found a way to lean into that maybe especially someone like me that feels walled off to that from how I was raised? Like, how can I find that again?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. The first thing I would say is this kind of disenchantment really goes all the way back to the Enlightenment. Okay, so when we start looking at the world in this mechanical way, and we kind of expel mind from the world, purposive intent from the world, and that's kind of the intellectual groundwork for this disenchantment. And eventually that culminates more and more, and we get all the way up until the 19th century, start seeing thinkers like Nietzsche with the pronouncement of God is dead, which is he's not saying literally God is dead. It's more of
no. If you read the article, it's nothing like what most people think he's saying.
No, not at all. It's not a metaphysical speculation about God. It's a cultural diagnosis. It's actually a warning. Our values are slipping. What are we going to do? How are we going to get back our values? And then you have Marx, who introduces this kind of historical materialism, and he talks about how it's not consciousness that shapes the world, it's the world that shapes consciousness. Okay. And you have guys like Darwin introducing, evolutionary theory, natural selection, gradual change over time. We didn't just arrive here out of air from like a divine fiat or anything like that. And then you have science, right, that starts to dispel nature of its purposive intent and meaning, its underlying meaning. And that's really the process of this. It takes a long time, but we start to really look at nature as a machine devoid of purpose and meaning. And really, to get that back, you just have to understand that nature is either meaningful or it's not meaningful at all. Just because science tells us, this kind of scientism, that nature doesn't have any kind of purpose to it. And the important thing is, that's not science, that's a philosophical claim, right? So once you step outside of methodology, you're no longer doing science, you're doing philosophy. So I always frame the question that, reality is either agential, that is to say, it either has agency or purpose, or it doesn't at all. And I think when we really look at the effects of reality, we see the beauty, the structure, the intelligibility of nature. It seems a lot like it will have purpose, that it always has had purpose.
So going back like 500 plus years, when we didn't have all this written down, we hadn't started trying to codify all this like we have, whatever was outside the realm of what a person could explain was divine. It was something supernatural, right?
Right.
Is it bad though for us to have gotten to where we are? Like, I'm not a mechanical guy, so to me a car might as well be running by magic. I can't break down the pieces and tell you exactly how it works. But if I understood that a little bit better, if I listened to my buddy who's a mechanic and actually learned all that, it would lose some of the wonder, and I would actually be able to take care of my car better because I understood it better.
Right.
So is it necessarily bad that we've lost some of the just attributing whatever we don't understand to the divine?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily bad. I mean, we definitely understand the world better in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
you know, in this kind of empirical immediacy of being able to understand the world. But going back to the car example, you know, you can understand the totality of the car,
Mm,
right, in physical terms.
sure.
But if you start to say, well, the car just it doesn't have any, there's no mechanic behind it, there's no builder behind it, that's a fundamentally different kind of
Mm,
claim, right? So even if you have a
mm,
full understanding of the car, that's great in terms of, you know, a kind of mechanical, physical sense. But once you make that move and say, well, there's no creator of the car, that's, like I said, it's a fundamentally different question. So in a
mm,
sense, it has helped us understand the world better, but it has also really taken us away from, again, this kind of purposive, meaningful intentionality underlying the entire system that we find ourselves within.
mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful because I think a lot of people have this all or nothing mindset where
Right.
they just tend to think, oh, well, science has explained so much, so we don't need God, or
Yeah.
God explains everything, so we don't need science. You know, more on the
Yeah.
fundamentalist side of where I
I
come
mean,
from.
even if science, just hypothetically, we're over
Yeah,
tomorrow. Okay,
yeah,
so we understood everything there is to know about the natural world. Chemistry is done, cosmology
mm,
is done. We still would not be an inch closer, as David Bentley Hart has said, to
mm,
understanding the mystery of being,
mm.
right?
So
Because
true.
the question of existence is entirely different than the physical arrangements of
Yeah.
the world, right? So why does anything exist at all rather than absolutely nothing? Okay, so
Mm,
no kind of scientific understanding of the physical world can ever talk about the question of existence. Those are two radically different questions.
I appreciate that. Now, speaking of existence and purpose and meaning in life, about a year or two ago, we did a series going through Ecclesiastes, one of my
Mhm.
favorite books of the Bible. I was able to go through every verse of it, get really nerdy with it. We talked a lot of philosophy, and in that case, you're getting into some darker stuff because he has a lot of just. Yeah, a lot of people say life is meaningless. I prefer translation saying life is passing or fleeting,
Yeah.
something along those lines.
Mhm.
But what would you say in terms of like a meaning of life? Because I do find myself a little more on the nihilistic side. And some of that could be with just depression that I've dealt with in my own life. But where can we find that meaning, especially for people who are no longer maybe finding it in institutional religion or
Yeah.
in how they were in things they were raised in? Like, how do we go about finding that when our foundations aren't as certain as they may have been before?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I forget who said this, but you know, you have to be comfortable with being struck by this intellectual vertigo. You know, I love that phrase, the intellectual vertigo. And we find meaning in the very fact of our limitations and that we're finite, fallible beings, that we really do not understand the world. But that's what makes it exciting, right? This kind of epistemic distance that we have toward the world, toward God at large. So I find a lot of meaning in that, just constantly searching for the answer, even though we cannot prove the answer, right? Because proof means finality, it means it's done. We can never really
Right.
prove anything, but we can always gesture toward this mystery that we find ourselves within. And that's what gives me a whole lot of meaning. And then, of course,
Mm,
just being able to have these phenomenal discussions like we're having now, you
mm.
know, forming meaningful relationships with others, acquiring knowledge from one another. I think those are really meaningful ways to spark a deeper kind of existential meaning or concrete meaning in your own life and the lives of
Mm.
others.
I agree. And I think that as media like podcasts and blogs like Substack and everything have become more common, it's actually giving a maybe not maybe purpose isn't the right term to use here, but it's fulfilling a purpose in a sense of it. It's drawing humanity forward where this
Mhm.
isn't just you and I talking. Now we're going to have people that have never met one or both of us and they're hearing this and it may affect how they view the world.
Yeah.
So that can change a lot more than we could have even just 100 years ago having this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's well said.
Mm-hmm. Now, something I've seen you do a lot on your Substack is talking about interfaith conversations.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you've written, especially a year or two ago, you were writing a good bit on Islam and trying to dismantle some stigmas against
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
So, what have those encounters outside of just Christianity revealed to you about God and life that you may not have understood before if you had just stayed solely within a bubble of people who believed like you?
Yeah, I mean, I've never been a part of really any kind of religion.
Fair.
I really view myself as a religious pluralist, if you will. I tend to look at
Mm,
religion as a garden of flowers with many different scents, many different varieties, but they're all coming from the same soil. They're emerging from the same soil. They're pointing,
mm,
gesturing toward the same sun. And I kind of think that's how I tend to think of religion, the
mm,
totality of religion. And I also think of it as, more of an experience rather than reducing it to an index of propositions. I
that's
think that
helpful.
many, yeah, I think that many religions can be true. I mean, we're finite human beings asking questions about the creator of the universe,
Yeah.
questions verging on the infinite. So, how could that ever be reduced to just one set of correct propositions?
Yeah.
So, I've never really viewed religion that way at all. Another good way to view it would be, imagine a mountain and you're walking up the mountain and you're just going up different paths, but you're still on the same mountain and you're aiming
Mm,
toward the top, the summit, which is God. We're all contingent extensions of God. And I think we have to recognize that more. We have to get outside of this kind of propositional box that we put ourselves in and embrace this plurality and this lived experience and this mystery and this wonder and this solidarity amongst one another as contingent extensions, contingent
mm,
creations of God. Now, when it comes to Islam, I think that it's really important to make a distinction between political Islam
mm.
and the more religious, intellectual, and spiritual tradition of Islam.
Okay.
That's not
Why is that?
often, yeah. So a lot of times, especially as Westerners, we tend to look at Islam through this kind of political lens.
Mm,
Terrorism, they're all bent out to destroy the West, kind of this
hmm.
monolithic sweeping. They're all the same. And this was especially exacerbated, Colin, especially post 9/11.
Absolutely. I was going to
You
ask
know,
if that's where that came from or if it
right.
existed before that.
I would, yeah, I would definitely say it existed before that, but certainly post 9/11, we really
Hmm.
start to see this kind of cropping up in more inflamed ways. But yeah, that distinction is absolutely crucial. Political Islam and the more religious, intellectual, and spiritual tradition of Islam has contributed a lot to the West: science, philosophy, mathematics. I mean, even the Kalam cosmological argument, which I'm sure you've heard of
Mm,
before, that emerges from medieval Islamic philosophy and theology.
mm.
So I think it's really important just to be able to look, it sounds cliche, but look outside the box and recognize that not, in terms of these interfaith discussions, that not all Muslims are the same,
Mm.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at Indonesia, for example, I think that's around an 87% demographic majority of Muslims, but they're
Mm,
very democratic. They have a lot of pluralism going on. And then you look at maybe
mhm.
like Saudi Arabia or Iran that are more theocratic, but we can't just say, oh, well, Islam caused that, right? We have to
Yeah.
look at colonial histories. We have to look at various geopolitical tensions, all kinds of factors that underlie and propel all of these things.
Right. And saying Islam believes X is like saying Christianity believes X. Like,
Right.
okay, what version are we talking? Protestantism, Catholicism, progressive, conservative, MAGA? Yeah, where are we going with this?
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I think it's really healthy. I mean, I hope one day religion shifts toward this more all-inclusive approach. I mean, I think if God
Mm,
exists, which I think he does, I
mm,
don't think he has a particular favorite team or speaks a particular language or is beholden to a particular culture. Right? This is just the finite human experience, the limited human experience up against that of the infinite and the divine, which ultimately culminates in God.
mm. So
So
what do you do then with the times when religions make exclusive claims. People will say Christianity is the way, and they'll pull out a verse out of John with Jesus saying, "I'm the way, the truth, and life." I would explain that differently, but you'll get that argument, or similar things from Islam or Judaism. So, do you just think the writers were wrong when they made those sorts of claims, or where would you go with that?
I think it all comes down to interpretation. At the end of the day, everyone's going to interpret things differently. I always tell my students that it really comes down to interpretation. So anytime you hear someone saying, "Well, no, I'm right, this is correct," you don't even need to talk about it anymore. They're missing the mark in a really, really bad way. Okay. Because everything comes down to interpretation. Now, in terms of "I'm the way, I'm the truth," I mean, perhaps Jesus meant, I'm the clearest way. If you follow me, you can maybe get to God quicker, or you can actualize virtue quicker.
Yeah.
But to say, a pious Muslim woman, if she doesn't follow Christ, that somehow she is making a grave error, but yet she pursues the good, the true, and the beautiful. She increases the liveliness of others. She's very bent on charity. To say if she doesn't follow that particular statement by Christ, that therefore she's made a grave error, or even worse, that she could be doomed for eternity, it just seems so obviously wrong. And I doubt the creator of the universe would function in that kind of way. I think he would care about how we live and how we act and treat others over what kind of theological or philosophical propositions we accept and or deny.
And I think some of the Christian listeners here may be a little uncomfortable with that. But I agree with you, because the mindset where we put our faith propositions over our actions is what got us to a place where Christianity is known more for its abuses in America, whether that's a scandal with priests in the Catholic Church or Southern Baptist Convention pastors, or every day we find some news story about a minister that had some sex abuse scandal, whatever it may be. Why? Well, because it was more about saying you believe the right things. And as long as you believe the right things, quote unquote, it doesn't really matter what you do. So we excuse a lot of bad behavior because, they believe in Jesus or whatever.
Right. Yeah, it's just a belief. Just believe in this and you're fine. It doesn't really matter how you act. Just believe this. I think that's a really bad way to approach it.
I agree. I've always been intrigued by, there's a passage where a couple of Jesus disciples were getting pissy about other people doing miracles. and Jesus said, "Other sheep I have that aren't of this fold." And that blew my mind as a fundamentalist back in the day, because I thought, you have literally Jesus walking along here. If there was ever a time to literally follow him, it's right now. He's right there. And he says, there are other people who are following me, but they're not walking around with us like you people are.
Right.
I think that's a good framework for what you're sharing here, is like, there are people who may not take the label that you do, but they're walking a much better life than some of the people who claim the same label.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think really it's how you act and how you live in this world that ultimately matters. I mean, especially if God exists. If God exists and he really is, the wellspring of love, of goodness, of truth, I think that would matter more. It just seems intuitively obvious to me that would matter more how you live. Yeah.
So I know for a lot of Christians, they would see God's existence as flowing obviously from their scriptures. You do not take a position of seeing the Bible as an inspired, inerrant book, and yet you are still a firm believer in God in some form.
Theist.
You believe you're a theist. So where are you drawing that from? How do you get to that position without the foundation that I think a lot of Christians would expect you would have to have?
Well, I think you can believe in God and not be a part of really any religious tradition. I mean, my belief in God primarily comes from philosophy, science, and I just really the immediacy of experience. I mean, I think really one of the best reasons to believe in God would be just look outside. Just look at the fact that something exists rather than nothing. That kind of childlike curiosity, that kind of childlike immediacy. If you were to ask a child, do you believe in God, or why does God exist? They would say, well, look at the flowers and the trees. and the skies. That's actually really good reason to believe in God, perhaps one of the best reasons to believe. So I don't really take scriptures as serious points of argumentation. I think we have to always primarily think philosophically above all else, from my perspective. And I still think even without appealing to scriptures, you can argue that God is love. God is goodness. If God exists, then he didn't have to create us. We're contingent creatures.
Sure.
The very fact that God created us as these participatory creatures within his creation seems an intuitive starting point to me that God must care and must want us here. I don't really think you have to necessarily appeal to scriptures or anything like that. I think you could just believe in God philosophically and, live a life of virtue and charity and love.
Now, if you're going at it that direction, saying just by nature of his creating us, there's a sign that he's drawing from a wellspring of love, or is a wellspring of love. This is something I struggle with when you're just trying to think about the existence of God. I kind of wonder, just in a thought experiment, about kind of a Loki style God, a trickster God. Like, what is there to say at the end of the day when we have all these different belief systems that claim this God exists, that one, why settle on one that is inherently loving? Why not say this is all just a sad trick? Because you look outside and you see the beauty of creation. You can also look outside and see suffering and war and famine and violence. So why choose the love side of it? Why go that direction?
Yeah, I mean, I would just kind of reiterate with what I said. It just seems that intuitively we have this creation. It's not, I don't think it would be a deistic God, as some people say, oh, well, maybe it's a deistic God. He created, he's gone. I think there are many arguments against deism, though. And Phaser, I don't know if you're familiar with Phaser, the Catholic philosopher,
I don't think so. No.
Theologian. He has argued in his book, a really good book called The 5 Proofs of God's Existence. He argues against deism. You could check that out, your viewers. But God would be like a deadbeat dad. He would just disappear. And I think, but creation is being sustained at every waking moment. So I don't think that God is the kind of being that's just like a deadbeat and just goes away and vanishes. I think God is sustaining every waking moment. So I would just kind of reiterate what I said. I just think that intuitively it seems like this creator would care about us, and that this creator loves us and has our best interest in mind, despite the problem of evil, which we can certainly get to. But again, ultimately, we don't really know this with any, we can't prove this. We can just argue abductively to the best possible explanation. Because Aristotle, if you were to ask Aristotle this question, he would say God eternally contemplates himself. And, he doesn't maybe really take interest in us at all. And there are other theologians too who think that God is not really a moral agent at all, like us. I think that's maybe Brian Davies. I could be wrong. I have his book somewhere. But he actually argues that God is not a moral agent. But I think God cares about us. I just think it's a good intuitive starting point. The fact that something exists rather than nothing. There are participatory creatures within creation like you and I who are conscious, who are able to reason, who are able to love, who are able to contemplate beauty, wonder, and God himself, able to think about God and ask questions about God. So it seems like God would love us and care about us in some capacity. Yeah.
So in that formation in your mind, what would this God look like? I'm assuming it's not an old man in the sky, like a lot of people imagine, but could it just be a force, an energy, or is it more personified, do you think?
I think it's more personified. I don't think it would be a force or an energy. I think it does have mind-like qualities. I think God is, classically understood. I think it's the correct way that God is the very ground of being. God is the infinite ground of being, the wellspring from which all other things flow out of. And that's a big question. I think you asked that on the email that you sent me about students getting confused about certain things. That's definitely one of them, that God is just this big man in the sky. right? Or he's just this object amongst other objects, but really understood properly, philosophically, God is the ground of all being, from which all things flow, from which all things move and have their being. So God is not just, somewhere out here in the universe where you can point and say, I think God's over there.
Yeah.
God is just the ground of being. He's being itself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as you teach those classes, do you deal more on like a freshman level or all throughout the different?
I teach at 3 community colleges. So it's really
Okay,
incoming students. And like I said, I really teach across the humanities and social sciences. I don't really teach a lot of theology courses at all.
Yeah.
That's kind of more of my own passion project, but I tried my best to infuse that into whatever topic I'm discussing.
I'm sure it comes up a good bit too. Like
Yeah,
we said
absolutely.
at the start, it's all related.
Yeah. And then another big one too, I wrote this down in my notes, but faith, if somehow faith is detached from reason, you just have faith, that's blind, that doesn't really comport to reason in any way, but it does because we have faith in all kinds of things, right? You have faith that your wife loves you. You have faith in X, Y, and Z, right? Faith is a trust or assurance in a given belief that you hold to be true. So that's another thing I really find with students a lot. They'll say, "Oh, you just have faith. That doesn't really mean anything. You need hard evidence." And I agree, you need hard evidence, but we place our faith in the evidence in hopes that it's true, in hopes that we can trust the reliability of our cognitive faculties.
Yeah, well, that's a whole side of it. A lot of people don't even think about is being able to trust that what we're actually reasoning about it is accurate.
Is accurate, yeah, exactly. Because we didn't create the universe, we didn't create our minds, and yet what's fascinating is there is this principle of correspondence between the universe and the mind. That is to say, we can actually penetrate the intelligibility of the world. We can, understand how the world works. We can do science. We can do philosophy. We can reason. So that's a mystery in and of itself. Why are our minds even capable of that?
Yeah, it is. I think you've written on this before recently too, but I think especially in a lot of Christian circles, there's a very narrow view of God. It's just whatever their pastor or priest or minister has told them, or they have a very curated reading list. I know, when I was growing up, that it was always don't read those people, or else you might lose your faith. And half the time, it was even people from a Christian background, Rob Bell or if they even knew who like a David Bentley Hart was or something, they wouldn't be okay with that.
Right.
So, how do you think we can have a broader, more open, more accepting view of God, of our faith, without feeling threatened by what's around us?
The initial point I made earlier is that we have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. This kind of intellectual vertigo. And I think your faith becomes even stronger when you're reading opposing arguments. So you can't just listen to what your pastor tells you to read. Oh, read this. Read this. You have to really explore outside of the box. You need to be reading atheistic literature. You have to be reading arguments against the existence of God, or even arguments against Scripture, different interpretations of Scripture. It's only going to make your faith stronger. And I always tell my students this too, even in terms of just political discourse. If you're, say, a socialist, what should you be reading? Well, socialist literature, but also conservative literature. You have to know what the other side is saying, and that's going to really just bolster your understanding overall of that side and your own arguments. It's going to make your own faith, your own arguments, even all that much stronger. So I would say just explore as much literature as you can, opposing literature, read and dialogue with other faith traditions, talk to other people of different faiths, and be comfortable with that. Don't see that as some kind of defeater or an erasure of your faith. It's ultimately going to bolster it and make it all that much stronger.
Yeah, and being able to do that without trying to argue or convert, just trying to dialogue and understand.
Yeah, that's another thing too. I would say from my perspective, I try at all times to avoid that kind of apologetic impulse, this desire to convert. I think that's wrong. You should desire to put within others the ability to think critically and carefully and passionately about the world. That should be your desire. If you're a Christian, you should be fine with someone who is an atheist. But as long as they know why they're an atheist and they have good reasons, right, you should be okay with that, because there are good arguments against the existence of God. There are good reasons not to believe in Christianity, not to believe in Islam, or to reject all religions.
Sure.
So we have to be comfortable with that. And that's what we should desire, to get people thinking, not to convert people. You want to get people thinking, and not necessarily how to think, but why. Why are things the way they are? Not necessarily how, but why.
Yes.
That's an emphasis that I really place on my students a lot. You need to know why, not necessarily how, but why. Yeah.
I love hearing that, because I know growing up in fundamentalist Christianity, we were told, oh, once you go off to college, they're going to try to tell you what to believe, and they're going to try to take away your faith. It's like, no, not at a good one anyway. In real colleges, the professors are trying to help you think about what to believe or how to believe. They're not sharing their own beliefs. They're not proselytizing like we were in the church.
Yeah, and it's a form of epistemic abuse. To tell you ought to think this way. You're thinking in the wrong way, think like me. And even these more fundamentalist interpretations of hell and whatnot, that if you don't think this way, something really bad might happen to your soul. I mean, that's abuse in all forms, psychological, epistemic. So just encourage people to think on their own and let them come to their own conclusions.
And if something shuts that down, that falls into the abusive category, and that's absolutely what a belief in eternal conscious torment does. We've talked a little bit about hell in scripture and theology here, and that's what I was raised with, was this eternal conscious torment that really messes with your sense of self and your sense of others, because I would not have been able to have this conversation with you having a difference of opinion, right? I have to try to convert you. I have to try to save your soul from burning. And that doesn't get us anywhere, because then I'm not seeing you as a person. I'm not learning from you. I'm just seeing you as a potential convert.
That's right. And again, that presupposes that God, like I alluded to earlier, really wants you to have the correct cognitive orientation, the correct propositional beliefs, or else. And that's so, to me, obviously false. That's so obviously the creation of very vengeful human beings, that want you part of their circle, increasing their identity. It just doesn't really make much sense to me at all.
No. And do you think we could carry this over also into pulpits and parenting as well, where we would say it's not so much about saying what to believe as it is teaching people how to believe better?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely. I think it could be there as well. Yeah.
That shift, it feels so much healthier, because you're no longer trying to cram something down someone's throat. You're just trying to help them be a better person. And even if they end up in a different spot, that's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you raise a child and that child says, I don't really believe in God. Look at the suffering in the world. Why are there kids dying of cancer? Why are there tsunamis, hurricanes, and tornadoes? I don't really think God exists. That's fine. I mean, that's fine, because that child is thinking critically about the world, and they're arriving at their own convictions.
It's just a matter of making sure that you've actually thought through it.
Yeah,
that's probably a lot of what you run into.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Just that's my principal concern: knowing why you believe what you believe. Yeah. That's the most important thing. Not telling you what to believe, but knowing. I just want to know why you believe what you believe, and are you able to tell me why and articulate that belief? That's what's important.
You've brought up the problem of evil there a couple of times, and I know that's something you've explored as well. And obviously, oceans of ink have been spilled over that topic. But just doing kind of a brief foray into it here, what would be your thoughts on having a loving God, but also a broken world that we see around us? How would you explain that?
Yeah, so just to break down the problem of evil for your viewers, it's really a perennial problem. That is to say, it's a problem that's been going on for a very, very, very long time, and it probably always will. It's the idea of, why is there so much evil in the world if there is supposedly this loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God?
Mm-hmm.
Why would he permit this to happen? And there's two formulations of the problem of evil. You have the
Mm-hmm.
logical problem of evil, which says that God and evil are incompatible. They're just incompatible. It's kind of like saying, draw me a square circle.
Yeah.
You just can't have that. You can't have that. Now, that problem still exists. There are philosophers who defend the logical problem, but a lot of philosophers have put their focus far more toward the evidential problem of evil, which is different than the logical problem. The evidential problem says, there's just so much evil in the world that God probably does not exist. Probably does not exist. Just the sheer magnitude, the distribution of evil, the seemingly gratuitous nature of evil, that therefore there's probably no God. That's different than the logical problem, though, again, which says God and evil cannot coexist. There's a logical contradiction like that of drawing a square circle.
The evidential sounds a little more not reasoned. What's wrong for it? It feels a little softer. Like it's not as harsh.
Right. Yeah, no, certainly the logical problem is definitely stronger. It's definitely stronger. Now, there are some defenders like J.L. Schellenberg. He's a contemporary atheist philosopher. He's formulated the argument from prior purity. And he basically says that, if God is perfectly good, if God is perfectly loving, how could evil enter the world at all? At all? How could evil ever enter the world? And he calls that the argument from prior purity. And that would be more in line with the logical problem of evil. But like I said, most philosophers think, the logical problem doesn't really work. Of course, God and evil could coexist with one another. Maybe you can employ tons of different theodicies like soul building and what have you, free will defense. So most philosophers are focused on the evidential problem that, there's just so much evil in the world. There's probably no God. Maybe there is a God, but it's not a loving one. Okay, so that's important. The problem of evil really only succeeds when you start ascribing these loving relational properties to God. If you're a deist, or you just believe God is just this, you mentioned this earlier, this force or this impersonal being of some sort, then the problem of evil doesn't really have any force at all. It doesn't matter because God doesn't care about us at all. So it only succeeds when you slap on these kinds of loving relational properties. So that's kind of the presentation of the problem of evil. Now, I think the follow-up was, how do I...
Yeah, which angle would you take on that then? Like how would you explain, isn't the right word, but how would you give an answer to someone who's really struggling with the problem of evil in the face of God's existence? Yeah, so I mean, I've been for the past couple of years thinking a lot about theistic finitism or finite godism, right? So Philip, into this. So Philip Goff, who was on my channel, he talks about this a lot. There are, Plato. This goes back a long time. There's another philosopher, I can't think of his name right now. He wrote a book in, I think, 1917 about theistic finitism. But my view philosophically is that I think that God is probably limited in some way. And what the limited God hypothesis says, theistic finitism, is that God is good. He's all-knowing in the sense that he knows all propositions. He knows what he has done. He knows what is going on in the world. But he's limited in power. That God wants to stop evil, but he just can't do it. Maybe he's metaphysically constrained by the very structure of reality. Or maybe he's just constrained in it of his own nature. He can't stop all evil. He would want to, but maybe he just can't stop it. Now, some people said, well, that seems like God is not God if he's limited or there's a defect. But I don't really think that follows, because I still could imagine a creator being immensely powerful. But just not all powerful. Think of a triangle. It would be very strange for me to say, a triangle doesn't have 5 sides. Therefore, that's just odd. Like the triangle is just limited in some way, or it's defective. Well, no, it's not. It's just the nature or the very essence of a triangle to have 3 sides. Now, it could be, I think it's something similar going on
there with God.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I've grown more comfortable with that in the past probably 2 or 3, I guess 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
And we talked recently on social media about Tom Ward's work with open
Yeah.
theology,
Yeah.
and
Right. Right.
he's been a guest on the podcast a few times now, where we've talked about how it can feel like you're giving up so much of God when you lose the idea of an all-powerful God. But there's nothing wrong with saying he's even the most powerful being in the universe.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that still doesn't necessarily have to mean all power.
Right.
Now, Tom takes that and says that he sees God's limitation because he doesn't believe God has a body. So without a body, God cannot physically step in and stop a child from drowning or someone from getting hit by a car or whatever. But he can influence us through the spirit, through however you want to word that, to be the ones that step in and do that to try to save the drowning child or whatever. Would you take that in a similar direction, or would you explain it differently?
I would probably explain it differently. I mean, it seems
Hmm.
like that God being a mind, if God is this kind of mind, that's the ontology of God, to be a mind, and God has causal powers to put things into being and to sustain creation. I wouldn't really take that approach. I'd have to read more into that, though.
Sure.
I have really not read much of his work at all, so I'd probably have to read
Yeah.
more into that. But it seems if God is all powerful, that he could stop a child from being tortured.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote this in one of my most recent articles. There was this case of Kelly Ann Bates,
Oh
and
yeah, I did read that one. Yeah.
yeah, she was a 17-year-old girl who was kidnapped and tortured for, I think, 3.5 weeks. And
Mm-hmm.
she had her hands crushed. She was beaten, I think raped. She had her eyes gouged out as
Mm-hmm.
well. And she was alive. That's the most disturbing thing. She was alive for about a week with her eyes gouged out. Now, if God is all powerful, why would God not stop that?
Yeah.
What would be the reason? Is there some kind of hidden good that would emerge from that? It would seem bizarre if there's some kind of that seems like the most gratuitous instance of suffering imaginable that God could stop. God could maybe intervene and give this man a heart attack. I mean, we're told that
Yeah.
God intervenes and God answers prayers. God
Mm-hmm.
it exercises miracles in the world. God can take life whenever he wants. But why not in that instance? Now, some people will say, well, the free will defense, and that does have
Mm-hmm.
some bite to it, though, because maybe God can't intervene in every single instance, right? Or
Yeah.
God would take a, how would a world look like that if God were to, if I was going to punch a guy right here and he brings my arm
Right.
back,
Right.
but maybe in specific instances like that of Bates, he could.
Mm.
And I mean, think about it. We restrict people's free will all the time. We imprison people. We
Yeah.
don't let our children smoke meth or run on highways. So
Right.
we even recognize that having too much freedom, abusing freedom is not good. We have to restrict that. We will stop you. But why
Right.
wouldn't God in that respect? What could be the reason? And I don't really see a reason at all. So
Mm.
I think when you look at theistic finitism, when you look at the empirical reality that we inhabit of just monstrous suffering, much of it that seems totally gratuitous, it seems to explain the data really well. Okay, because it answers why God isn't intervening. He's limited. He's
Yeah.
constrained in some way. But then on the other end, it answers the data of the beauty of the world,
Mm.
the structure, the intelligibility of the world. So it seems to explain both pieces of data really well. Yeah, we do have an intelligent, powerful creator. Look at what he has done. But we
Mm.
also have so much evil in the world and monstrous suffering. Well, what's up with that? I thought he's all powerful. Well,
Mm.
maybe he's just limited. It seems to explain the data really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And something I like to say is that God should not be less moral than I am. So if I can look at something like that
Right.
and
Yeah.
say I would step in and stop that if I could, then we
You
have
would.
to have something wrong about God.
Well, we do. And let me give you a thought experiment right here by Michael Humer.
Sure.
Imagine you and I are, say you stayed over for the weekend, we're watching hockey together.
Mm.
and my neighbor over here is bringing bodies into the house every night. And, we see it, and the next day the cops knock on the door and they say, "Did you see what was going on over there?" And we say, "Yeah, I saw it the whole time, but, I don't know. I could have stopped it, but I just didn't do it because I'm respecting the killer's free will."
Right.
Or maybe there's some kind of virtue or greater good that's coming from that. The first responders are, they're obtaining a lot of virtue from this, or they're going to heaven anyway. They're going to be with God. That would seem just bizarre. And this is, I don't know if I mentioned it, but this is from Michael Humer, this thought experiment, in one of his articles. Yeah. So it just, you get that kind of stuff a lot. God's just mysterious. We don't know why. Maybe he just has a greater purpose, but none of that seems to provide a coherent answer at all as to why it is happening right here and now. Why is it happening? And if you hold to these classical omni properties, I think that you're going to run into a lot of trouble. Even omniscience too, although this is more aligned with open theism.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I too question God's knowledge. I mean, I think God is immensely knowledgeable insofar as he understands all propositional knowledge. He knows, like I said, what he has done, what he will do. But maybe God doesn't know exactly what you will do tomorrow at 1 p.m. Right? Maybe he just knows a future of possibilities. Right? He knows that we'll do good and bad things, but he doesn't know exactly what we will do in any kind of exhaustive sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I often, this is kind of like having children. You create children, but you don't know exactly what your children are going to do. There's a future of possibilities that they'll do very good and bad things, but you still think life is intrinsically beautiful enough to create instead of not creating. Well, maybe God is in a very similar situation. Maybe he didn't know Hitler, for example, would commit a Holocaust, right? So I think when you look at these omni properties, saying God is all knowing in this kind of exhaustive sense, God is all powerful, you run into a lot of problems when you're trying to explain away the problem of evil. And it's not even just human suffering either; it's animal suffering as well.
Yeah,
I mean, monstrous suffering, animals ripping apart each other in the wild. The long process of evolution, animals going extinct. I mean, it seems odd that if God is perfectly powerful, he's all powerful, he's all knowing, he's omni everything, that he would allow this to persist. Just seems odd to me.
No, that's where I've come to as well. And with the whole idea of omniscience and God's knowing everything, I tend to fall somewhere between what is called Molinism and open theology. And the example I always give with it is Doctor Strange from, I think it was in Infinity War, where he's got the time stone and sees the 14 million whatever possibilities of their fight with Thanos, and Iron Man says, "Well, how many do we win?" And I go, "One." Right? I wonder, could that be the way that God is, quote unquote, all knowing, that he sees all the possible futures, all 14 million whatever? He doesn't necessarily know which one we go with. He just knows that when we go with 12 million 100,000 whatever possibility, that this is where that's going to lead us. Like it's the possibilities rather than just a certainty of this is a determined future.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, I think, like I said, I don't really adhere to any kind of strict dogmatic omni properties. I mean, just because the classical tradition has said X, Y, and Z, that doesn't mean it's true. That doesn't mean it's true. We tend to find a comfort in the idea that, well, Thomas Aquinas believed this, Duns Scotus believed this. That doesn't mean that they were right, though. They're still limited human beings. So, yeah, I mean, that definitely could be the case. I just think something is going on. Like I said, we see beauty, we see power, we see structure, intelligibility within the very fabric of creation, but we also see immense suffering, and we have to find something that explains both pieces of those data, and I think finite theism does that, and maybe even open theism to a degree as well.
Yeah. Now, a minute ago, you touched on prayer, and I think this is tangential to what we've just talked about here, because a lot of people have this idea of prayer where you even drew this out in a recent article too. I forget which one it was, but you criticized how we will be praising God for the small wins, quote unquote, that come from prayer. I couldn't find a parking space and I prayed and I found one, or I couldn't find my keys and I prayed, found it.
Right. Yeah.
But then you have someone who's been kidnapped and is praying for God to save them, and rescue doesn't come in time. And in those cases, we go, oh well, whatever reason, God was testing us, free will, the devil, whatever. So we kind of like ascribe all the good stuff to God and just say all the bad stuff is human error.
Yeah.
So what are we missing with prayer there? Like, if it's not for just getting outcomes, what would be the purpose of prayer?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my perspective that prayer, I would take a Kierkegaardian kind of approach, that prayer is not to change God or anything like that. It's to change the person, the function of the person praying. I think prayer is ultimately about self-transformation. I think it's about gesturing toward the mystery of being, toward others around you within your society, this kind of solidarity. And yeah, I don't think it really has a lot outside of that. I think, again, when we look at the horrors of empirical reality, it does not seem like there is an agent answering prayers. It just doesn't seem like that at all. I mean, children are dying every single day, and their parents are praying very fervently, and their prayers are not answered. And then maybe, your flight arrives safely in Germany and God answered my prayer. He loves me, or I got a raise at work. It's just, maybe things are just happening. Maybe that's just not what prayer ever meant. This kind of outcome that you're talking about. It seems to be this kind of self-transformation. It's to change the function of the one who is praying. It doesn't, outside of that, it just doesn't really seem to have much significance to me. Yeah.
Do you think it has any effect on God, or is it just about transforming our posture?
Be hard to say if it has any effect on God. I mean, I'm sure it does. I don't know what God would be thinking about when we're praying, how that affects him. I'm not really sure. I can't really answer that in any precise sense. But, certainly I just think it's really about self-transformation, prayer at the end of the day, this solidarity with those around you, and, just carving out more and more virtue for oneself. But outside of that, if you're saying, well, no, God answers prayers, he intervenes all the time, the empirical data just doesn't seem to demonstrate that at all. And go back to the Bates case. I mean, I'm sure she was praying.
Yeah.
I'm sure her family was praying as well. And God did not answer that prayer in the way we typically think he would, that he somehow intervenes within reality and changes this particular state of affair. It just, why wouldn't he do that? Maybe that's just not the way that prayer works.
Yeah. I would agree. That's a big area I want to get into in future episodes of the podcast. I've been saving up thoughts on doing a whole prayer series, because we have so many assumptions about it, and I don't think we're hitting what it does. I almost wonder too, and I don't know, maybe this is a little too new agey, but I wonder if it can also have a way of connecting us as human beings. Of like, if I'm praying for someone that I know is suffering, like maybe it's not just changing me, but maybe in some way it's connecting the two of us in some way where they feel more loved or cared for because I was doing that.
Oh, I completely agree. That's what I meant when I said the solidarity component of prayer.
Okay, yeah.
That's what it promotes as well. It brings people together. It makes us aware of one's suffering in relation to our suffering. So it definitely has that solidarity component to it. It's not just for self-transformation. It is for the community, for those around you to relate to one another, to uplift one another from suffering and similar despairs that we go through collectively.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So it's important. It's again, it's not that prayer is meaningless. I'm not saying that
No, not
prayer
at
is
all.
meaningless. I'm just saying I don't think it does what we think it does. I don't think when you pray, let my flight get to Florida safely. If that happens, I don't think God made that happen. I don't think God somehow intervened within reality and did that. I think it just happened.
Yeah.
Right. I don't think that is the correct way to think about prayer. And I don't think many serious theologians and mystics would view prayer in that way at all.
No, that's more just the
Right.
average person in the pew
Yeah.
that tends to view it that way. It doesn't
Right,
like trickle
exactly.
down.
Yeah.
Mhm. I mean, that just goes back to the car illustration from the start. Like,
Yeah.
just because you understand it better and maybe a little bit of the magic of it is gone, doesn't mean that it's any less useful, any less important, any less created, with the car. So it's like the same thing with prayer. Just because what you thought it did got taken away doesn't mean that it is now useless. Or
Absolutely.
if God isn't all powerful, that doesn't mean he is powerless. We have to have a room in between the binary, the either or extremes.
Right. And that's our modern flaw of not seeing, like I said earlier, this kind of purposive underlying meaning within things, and that's the kind of residual dogma of the Enlightenment, as I talked about earlier, looking at the world as devoid of meaning. Oh, this is, this car over here is that's just the car. It's just a machine, or the world. Yeah, it's just the world. But for most of history, the world would have been seen as flowing with purpose, with meaning, with divine spark, if you will. But that has kind of gone away. I'm not saying the world is completely disenchanted, but it certainly has the disenchantment that once captured us has eroded slowly over time. And there's a really good book called The Enchantments of Mammon by Eugene MacArthur. It's a big, thick book. I mean, it's like, I think it took him 20 years to write it, but he talks about this. So if your followers ever want to check that out, I would recommend it. It'll take you a while to read, but it's well worth it.
Okay, we can link to that as well.
Yeah.
Now, we have gone all over the spectrum here talking about it quite a bit. And
Right.
I love that. Is there anything else that has been on your mind, something you've been writing about or that you've thought about as you were prepping through this that you want to make sure we address before we get to the end here?
So you did ask me about American Christianity, my thoughts on American Christianity.
Oh yeah.
Which is a really big one. Yeah. So I would say that American Christianity and most Christianities, are pretty foreign to that of Christ, I would say. And this is one thing I remember David Bentley Hart said, that if most Christians knew Christ, they would hate him. They wouldn't like him at all. And you might wonder why. Well, it's because of his radical demands that he placed upon us. And, Christianity is not just praying, sitting in a pew and telling people, well, I hope you're saved. It's not just to make you feel good about yourself, this kind of self-help guide. It's actual radical action within the world. So a true Christ-like political arrangement, in my eyes, would have a radical reimagining of our relationship with others, how we think about what we spend, right? Our entire economic life would just have a totally different kind of look. And, I think that a lot of this Christianity is, American Christianity is very entangled with capitalism as well.
Yep.
Used as a defense of capitalism. And if you look at the organizing logic of capitalism, it surrounds profit, consumption, accumulation, right? These all seem very at odds, if not entirely antithetical, with Christ's teachings in many respects.
Yeah, you're talking about the guy who told a rich man that to get to heaven, he had to sell everything and give to the poor.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, and this also culminates in what's called bourgeois individualism as well, which I think is antithetical to Christ as well. But you see individuals start to think of themselves, because of this overriding capitalist logic, that we're just self-interested, we're competitive instead of cooperative. And that to me just doesn't seem at all on par with anything that Christ taught. Christ would have been, if he were here today, he would completely denounce that and advocate for this kind of radical altruism, these egalitarian principles. So, in short, I think that Christianity, in terms of American Christianity and going back to Christ and the early Christians, they just don't really seem the same at all. They seem incompatible in many ways. Even just the thought of seeing yourself as an individual, I am an individual, I own myself, self-ownership, that would have been totally foreign to early Christians.
That's a modern Western idea. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. They didn't see themselves as owning themselves. They were owned by God, and they had a deeper kind of obligation to the community around them. So a lot of this American Christianity really completely detaches us from social reality and our obligations that Christ would advocate for.
Mm-hmm. Now, where do you think we lost that? Is it something that we can trace back and say at the time of the Reformation or the Crusades or Augustine or something like, where do you think it started to veer off from what the original movement that Jesus had was into something different?
Yeah, it's hard to say exactly when. I mean, I've talked to a lot of Christians that have said really Christianity practiced in a way that really resembles that of Christ would be the Desert Fathers. This kind of emphasis on community, not elevating, profit or self-interest over that of need and the broader good of the community. So, I mean, that's probably the clearest expression of, Christ consciousness put in practice that we've ever seen. I mean, I think, I definitely think that the capitalism, which is not just an economic system, it's actually a systematic logic. It's an organizational logic that shapes our entire perception of how we view the world. I certainly think that has propelled a lot of this as well. This kind of,
And I'm of the camp that I think Jesus was an apocalyptic teacher, where he really did believe that the end of his age was coming very shortly.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman talks about that a lot.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's why he was so extreme in the things he said, because if the world is, I think this is something Bart says, if the world's ending on Tuesday, it doesn't matter if you give everything away. Like, you might as well go help someone who has nothing until Tuesday when you have more. But as time has gone on and the world didn't end on Tuesday, Christianity has had to adapt to say, how can we still value the teachings of someone who thought he was living at the end of time when time hasn't ended?
Yeah, certainly. Good point. Now, real quick, what you asked me, what did you ask me a moment ago when this kind of individualism started to happen? Is that what you said? I might have missed.
Yeah, not just the individualism, but just kind of a departure from the collectivist mindset that Jesus had and his teachings. And like, where do you think you could draw a line and say it's going off track?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't mention, but we could talk about liberalism too. Of course, this putting more emphasis on the individual, dignity of the individual, but that's different than this kind of bourgeois individualism, which is a far more aggressive form, which says that human beings ought to just be individuals. They're self-interested, they're competitive instead of cooperative. And I think that culminates more and more in this kind of isolation and this detachment from social reality and the obligations that you have to the members of your social reality. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, it does take quite a while, but that's where I would place it.
No, I appreciate it. Well, I know we are getting close to time here, so I want to make sure I give you a chance before we have to wrap it up to rep anything you're working on. You want to talk about your blog or your YouTube channel, anything that's exciting you that you want the listeners to know and how they can find you?
Yeah, certainly. You can find me on YouTube at Conscious Philosophy. I host podcast discussions. I've had Philip Goff on, Nathan Robinson, JP Moreland, Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy has been on around 3 times, amongst others as well. Josh Rasmussen, really great.
We've had some great people on there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And my Substack is, you just search Eric Van Evans, Sense of Wonder. And I write about philosophy, theology, current events, politics, lots of things. And that's where you can find me if you ever wish to check out my work or chat further.
Sounds good. We'll be sure to link to all that. And Eric, thanks for taking the time to talk today. It's been really great getting to catch up and just talk through all these different thoughts. And I think there's a lot there that we can have to think about through the rest of the week now.
Definitely. Colin, thanks, man, for having me. I really appreciate it. We covered a lot of interesting ground and looking forward to talking in the future.
Likewise.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.